Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar, talking about helping students manage academic anxiety. We're going to fill the room here. I see people coming in, and now that it's 8 o'clock, so give us a second. And there'll be a poll that pops up. It's really short and sweet. Are you a parent? Are you a student, educator? And if so, if you are a parent, guardian, or student, which grade you're in. So I have a sense of where you're coming from. So just take that, and I still see the numbers creeping up. Let's give everyone a few more minutes. Not minutes, actually less than a minute, but I'm waiting for the plateau to hit, then we'll jump right in. Okay. All right, so a few notes. Tonight, we're gonna have a conversation about anxiety, helping kids who are working through that. And we're gonna this deck, we're gonna record this conversation. It's already being recorded, and we're gonna send you a copy of this probably either by Friday or by Monday, and that'll be there. You can watch it, go back, review different sections, and we're gonna have time at the end for Q&A. I will definitely save time for that, which is important, I believe. So I'm glad you're here, and it's an important topic. Anxiety is fairly widespread these days for a variety of reasons. And the world we live in, the fact that, there's a lot of uncertainty, whenever you have a sense of things that are not in your control and things that matter, that's typically when there's a sense of a foreboding, a sense of anxiety. And there are things right now that are happening to a number of folks. I've many friends and colleagues, some who work at the CDC or the DOJ, and there's anxiety because we don't know what's next. What's next week look like? And some kids, they're thinking about what happens if I don't do well in this exam, or I have a midterm coming up next week. If I fail the midterm, do I fail the class? Things in the future that the consequences are meaningful, and sometimes that can beget anxiety. So why don't we go ahead and jump in and talk about this? So anxiety, it's one of the most prevalent issues that we face here in the U.S. We actually are the most anxious nation on the planet in terms of the percent of people who have a diagnosis of anxiety, and then those who take anxiety medications. About a third of Americans will suffer a clinically important anxiety condition over the course of their lifetime. So we're ahead of most other, or actually all industrialized nations. So anxiety is pretty prevalent. So anxiety in academics is not that surprising. It's the first time that students are facing challenges, possible setbacks, and so forth. And we're really seeing this. I have friends, colleagues who work on the college side. I have a counseling background, and some of my colleagues went on to become counselors and therapists on college campuses, and they're working hard. Massive, massive need. And the mental health, like the stigma has really become decreased. People are getting help, but now like the floodgates are open, and so many people are going for support and for counseling and therapy. So right now, anxiety outstrips all other concerns in college campuses. That by the time they have a national college health assessment, and over a third of students have been diagnosed with a anxiety condition over the course of their lifetime. And about 6 in 10 students say that they're currently actively, the time of the survey, dealing with anxiety real time. So this is real. And there are a lot of reasons why it's happening, what's going on. It's not just, the language, but it's, things have shifted, the landscape has shifted. There's a lot more uncertainty in many areas. So mental health, you probably know, there have been, COVID wasn't good for our mental health. And now if you have kids who were 17, they started, when they were 12, COVID hit. And a lot of their formative times that they were, there's a lot of anxiety, uncertainty, and so forth, more depression, more anxiety, maybe more suicide. I've had that, I've touched some of my actually personal students. And it's become a real topic for parents, educators, clinicians, and so forth. So we're dealing with this right now, and it's really a concern because we all care deeply about our kids, making sure they're okay, and that they have the tools and resources they need. And to me, when I think about anxiety academically, it's your academic life is a relatively small sliver of your total life, but you're learning how to handle stress, how to handle challenges, setbacks, and the skills and resources you develop in high school, you're going to carry those forward. And if you're under-resourced now, there's a concern that, will I have the resources at 20, at 25? And so when you have anxiety emerge now, it's actually an opportunity to begin to build some skills that are going to be really important throughout a person's life. And one of my colleagues, he's over at Emory, talks about the issue is not necessarily the fish. your child. The issue is the pond, and the issue is, the environment, the systemic pressures that are coming at students, their technologies, the landscape around us, other, media, social media. There are things that are affecting kids' mental health, which is, the reason why it's happening it's an epidemic, whatever it's at a much broader scale than just individuals who are grappling with their own thing. It's a societal, it's a larger thing than just my kid has anxiety. He's thinking about some of the things going on, and this morning I went and added the thing for AI because honestly, of all the things that are causing anxiety, everyone has their own stuff. For me, it's my two big ones are health and AI. Thinking about my kids, thinking about the workforce, and sometimes it's interesting, like the things that interest you that scare you, you spend more time on. I remember my grandmother used to watch Fox News, and she, when there's fear, you just get plugged in. And for me, because you're trying to control things that you can't control. And so one of the ways is get more information. Try to, learn all you can. I tend to do a lot of podcasts and reading and books on AI, but that doesn't always bed down concerns about where things are going and so forth. But kids are looking out at the world and they're like, what's going on? Where's their terra firma? Where, in terms of making a living? And the whole thing is like, why do kids care about academics? If I get an A or a B or a C, they're thinking forward. Anxiety typically is, where does this go? If things don't work out here, how might this affect me, this grade here, but then my college admission, or then in terms of job placement or my career, it's always in the future. That's how anxiety functions. And so for me, like there's, what's happening right now with these large language models, but to me, it's what's happening in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out with my kids who are currently 2 and 4. I'm thinking, and there's that sense of powerlessness of where this might go and what's in my control, which is not very much in certain areas. So kids are feeling stress. It's coming at them from the outside. And parents, if you're on this webinar, some of you experience stress because very often, if your kids have anxiety, there's some chance that someone in the family, the mother, the father, someone somewhere, the grandparent has anxiety as well. That's pretty common. But the pressures on today's kids are greater than the pressures on us. I graduated high school in '94, and there are more kids have anxiety and depression now than did back then. And looking around at what's the average life look like, the average schedule, the number of APs, the academic rigor, it's typically greater today than it was back then. And the pressure to excel starts young. And I see, yeah, even we're trying to, get our daughter into kindergarten, and even seeing, some of the pressures parents are feeling about, can we get into this school? And if you're going to get into school in this grade, this is the window, then we can't get in till. I see some of the parents, some of the pressure of, oh gosh, like, these longer term consequences. And I'm seeing that even as my kids going through this admissions process, in March of this year. So we are asking more of our kids. Than was asked of us, and especially when it comes to attention and managing attention and all the distractions and all the social comparison. It's a different environment than when we were young. And all the information coming at us in this steady, constant stream of things vying for your attention, it's challenging, and it creates, a sense of being unsettled. It's not as quiet. There's less time in reflection. There's less time. There's a brain state. It's called the default mode network, where the brain, it's not actively feeding, processing. It's kind of in this restful state. It's able to integrate. It's able to reflect. Kids are doing less reflecting, and there's more of a hyperstimulation, which, but in of itself, creates more anxiety, and so forth. So again, we're a little more anxious. So are our kids. Things happening around the world. Things happening with climate. There's eco anxiety. That's real. Politics, the discord, that's real. AI concerns, it's all real. And so we can't dismiss it. One of my students I'm working with right now, she's out in Michigan, and she has some anxiety issues, some concerns. And her parents, and she's really concerned. She has a brother at LGBTQ, about her brother and things are happening in the climate. And her parents try to tell her, don't worry about it. Which I was talking to her yesterday. And that is more of a dismissive of, you can't change it. Why are you giving this your attention, your energy? And that honestly is not going to work, because there's a reason she's thinking about this, and there are consequences. But telling someone just ignore it, versus my thing is, how do you find a way to regulate? You're concerned, you're going to seek out news, information, all this stuff, but how do you have a boundary around it so it's not overwhelming? How do you have some limits? So you'll spend 30 minutes, but not 3 hours going down these rabbit holes or learning or being nervous, doom scrolling, whatever they call it. But again, the kids need, they're going to be going towards this because they have some fears, some anxieties, and so forth. Now, our language is really important. This is my colleague at Emory gave me some of this concept that, we talk about anxiety, and is there a distinction between I have some stress, I'm a little bit worried, versus I'm anxious? Because anxiety, it is a clinical term, and not everyone who has some stress or some worries has anxiety. Being concerned about a test coming up, in many cases, that's very adaptive. That's actually healthy and very normal. You need some level of stress, some level of arousal to perform at your best. If you have no stress, no arousal, whatever, you almost never hit peak performance. So a little bit of stress, it's great. But when it becomes a condition where it's debilitating, it's minimizing, it causes suffering, that's when we're moving from stress or worry to anxiety. And it's important, and my colleague says, let's use the word anxiety less. Talk about, are you feeling some stress, a little bit worried? And that reframing the language can be beneficial to kind of to depathologize an actual human experience. So an anxiety, again, is an abnormal sense of fear, apprehension, nervousness about what's coming down the future that may be out of our control, and so forth. So again, stress, normal reaction to immediate perceived actual threat. Anxiety, the fear is in the future, where the threat of danger is a possibility. And this is from my colleague and friend, Gary Glass. And when you start feeling afraid about these outcomes, that might shift your focus way in the future where you can affect things in the present. And one of the important things, like when you are anxious or when you're fearful or stressed, the whole thing is, what can I control right now? And typically anything you can do in the moment helps activate actually the frontal cortex. And when the frontal cortex gets activated, it has wiring and connectivity back to the amygdala, which the little almond-shaped part of the brain in the limbic system in the brain, and it sends a neurotransmitter called GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. It goes back and it calms and quiets the activation of the amygdala. So when you get into problem solving, by its very nature, it calms down anxiety. So it's like, don't just sit there, do something that's real. When you begin activating your problem solving centers, you become like your anxiety, your arousal decreases. So it's when you're doom scrolling and not acting and just feeding, that's when anxiety can mount. So the question is, what can I do right now in the moment? And that's where the difference is stress, maybe motivating to do something, versus anxiety that can be paralyzing. And you've heard of the fight, flight, freeze, or fold. Some people, when they get in this anxious state, it really is freeze up or just collapse, versus let's actually go into the active mode, which is beneficial for anxiety. This is a 100-year-old plus curve, Yerkes-Dodson curve, which to me is really important, and maybe the most important slide in the whole talk is like thinking about, where are we on this continuum? That performance, we all want our kids to do well academically. And when you have too little stress, too little concern, you're not going to achieve your best outcome. You need some stress. So this matters, this counts. And I got that arousal makes me get in gear. Then there's a place called eustress. EU, like EU is positive euphemism, eulogy. And that's the right level of stress. It's optimal. And then you go into distress. And that's where your performance begins to decrease because you get off topic with your thinking. Your thinking gets flooded of all these images of what if things go wrong. It also obstructs your working memory. And working memory is one of the pillars of academic performance. When you can read something, keep it momentarily in your working memory store, go get other information and come back. And my kids who have real test anxiety, they'll read a question, a prompt, they'll go to the passage, go back to the prompt, and they'll just forget, what did I just read? And that's because what's happening is there's too much cortisol. And a little bit of cortisol, a little bit of epinephrine is brilliant. You need it, you focus, you're attentive, but too much, and that's where it affects working memory. So this thing really is physiological. When anxiety kicks in, it does affect you neurochemically, and it affects processing and so forth. So, and there is a distinction. Typically, you see more anxiety in females. The curve's a little bit different in terms of where typically guys are more often on the left, girls more often on the right side, and the curve's a little bit shifted. But again, I've seen plenty of guys who are very anxious and plenty of girls who are cool and collected and cucumbers. So it's like the grand scheme, it's just where you are individually on this curve. But some anxiety, some stress, Some arousal, you need it. It's a good thing. It's not pathology. It's actually helpful. And that's important. And can I bring a kid back who has too much? And there are times with some kids, can I get them a little bit more concerned that this actually matters, and so forth. So again, a perceived threat. This might hurt me. This might hurt my future potentials, outcomes. If I do bad on this thing, everything collapses. I'm not going to get into school. I'm not going to get in this major, this career, this life, that everything I've imagined, it goes away in the future. And that's anxiety. But again, this perception of a threat versus, you know what? There are many potential outcomes. If I get a B in this class, my life doesn't end. Does that foreclose one opportunity? Maybe. But will there be others? Yes. And it's that rigidity of thinking that in cognitive behavioral therapy, that rigidity is really one of the sources of deep anxiety and that can be paralyzing. It's called dichotomous thinking. It's either this or that. Either I have a perfect GPA and I get into the school, or my life is over. And it's not. It's so that kind of thinking as parents, we have to help massage that, work that, like going through the possibilities, and being a little less rigid, more open to the many possibilities. Even if you have a 3.0 or a 2.5, there are many, many, many colleges that'll accept you where you can begin your life and go forward. And yeah, getting two Bs, maybe you're not going to get into Princeton. Okay. But think about all the other schools who are going to desire you, want you, even if you get a couple Bs on your transcript. And so it's helping pop the balloon of that pure, perfect, rigid, fragile thinking, in my experience. So some stress, perfectly normal. Again, some of the stress hormones, a little epinephrine, good. A little bit of cortisol, it is useful. We need it. Low level stress, you can still plan and problem solve, have a few repetitive thoughts, worries, no problem. And then you can learn how to calm yourself down and how to manage the stress response. So we're going to all experience stress. And that's why I think academic anxiety can actually be useful because you're learning how to manage yourself in this, in my opinion, a relatively low stakes. I mean, academically, if I get a 3.5 or a 3.6 or a 3.4, there's going to be a college somewhere. I'm going to go to college. But in terms of does it really foreclose opportunities in my life in a meaningful way? I don't believe so. But in other areas of life, you have to really learn how to manage yourself. So to me, this is all good practice. So too much fear, maladaptive. You shut down the frontal cortex. You're living in the amygdala. It's all fear and threat. Self-trust. I don't trust myself, my ability to impact or work on, the outcomes of my environment. I feel like I'm a pinball being bounced around, and now you start imagining things in the future being very scary, dangerous, and so forth. And this can affect you, academic anxiety. It can affect also you socially. I've seen kids who are anxious or withdrawing socially. It can affect, and there's a problem. There's a disorder when your behaviors, when your sleep gets off, your eating gets off. That's typically when something is not right. And that's sometimes when it's time to have a conversation, sometimes even go get some help. If the anxiety about school is affecting the eating, the sleeping, it's like then now we're in the problem area. Now it's time to go seek out some kind of intervention, in my experience, or at least have a very serious conversation about what's going on with you right now. And this is, Gary's framing of this is the opposite of control, is trust. And, can I trust that even if things aren't perfect? And I have a kid right now who last semester failed the computer science class. He's trying to finish up her degree. Probably it's going to be not this May, but in the fall. She'll probably hopefully walk in December. And she didn't pass the first class. And again, finding life still moves forward. So it's going to be one more semester. But again, your life is not over. And it's helping versus if you believe if I don't graduate with my class on time, somehow my life is derailed. And it isn't the truth. I was finishing my master's in counseling and I was really stressed out. I was running the business and I was doing an internship at Emory in their counseling center. And it was crazy. And my dad said, Jed, what if you back off your classes and just graduate in 3 years, not 2? And it was my dad's insight and wisdom, having someone I trusted my father and I respected him. It's like, you know what? I think he's right. And actually, I did that. I pulled back from my classes and I finished not with my cohort in 2 years, but in 3 years. And life goes on. And that's part of it too, is someone says, take the gap year. Someone who has your respect, has your best interest at heart. And it's like, you know what? Life does go forward either with that stuff. Learning how to trust that it's going to be okay, even if my perfect plan changes. And then as we are older, in our 40s and 50s, we realize our perfect plans change all the time. But when you're a kid, when you're 16, 17, you're new at this. You're new at your plans changing. And very often you haven't had to change your plans for life, or someone's health issue or some other work thing happens, or you lose a job. We learn as adults how to navigate and pivot, but kids sometimes need support learning how to be more flexible cognitively, and that lowers anxiety. Parents, what can you do? You're always balancing, how do I help my kid? How do I create an autonomous, independent kid? You want both. You want someone who can navigate life's challenges, but also we want to provide the right level of support for our kids. And we see our kids having anxiety, and we obviously want to help. We love our kids. And so part of it is you watch and observe, how are they working with this anxiety, this stress. We don't want them to go towards destructive behaviors. And some kids who are anxious do some self-harm. One of my former colleagues, Janet Franzoni, used to work down the street from Westminster, like one of the top schools in the Southeast, where my sister went to high school. And her entire practice as a therapist was people who were cutting and people doing self-harm. A lot of the girls, like 1 in 5 girls, they were doing the self-harm stuff as a means of coping with anxiety. And some of it was academic, some of it was social, but they were trying to manage their feelings by, using the pain of the, small cut. And I had a student who was putting out cigarettes on his arm. And it was like, I was a little overwhelmed by that when it was many, many years ago, but he was trying to deal with stress, and he didn't know how to manage it. And so the whole thing is, what are your skills? And some kids just push it back. You can use substances, you can numb out, you can alcohol, pot, THC. There are many ways to manage feelings. Some of them are very maladaptive, some of them are very, very healthy. So it's watching, observing, talking, how are you managing the stress of it academically? What are your resources? Some kids are really under-resourced. Some kids haven't learned. They may learn from their peers, but the question is, did they learn from you? Have you shared with them the things and resources that you go to? And some parents are very open. Some parents, you have to be explicit and have a conversation and demonstrate the ways that you manage stress, because we all feel stress. And at some level, if your kids think you're perfect, you don't ever go through stress, that's tougher on the kids because they feel stress, versus a parent who can model, I go through really hard times too. There are times I get scared. There are times when I was going through college or whatever, grad school, I was really nervous. I wasn't going to finish or do my thing. Here's how I dealt with that. And your kids can learn from you, especially when you show them vulnerability. Students, young kids often don't want to hear their parents telling them what to do, but when parents kind of show their scars and their wounds and where they're vulnerable, sometimes the kids pull in a little bit closer, like, oh, wow, I didn't know that about you. I didn't know you actually, I see you as successful or degreed or whatever, making the living for the family. I didn't realize you had these hard moments in your past. So sometimes, yeah, sometimes kids need extra help beyond what a parent can offer. For sure. I've seen that with some of my good friends and their kids. And help, is out there. And sometimes you have to pivot from your skill level to someone who's trained in this clinically. Pediatricians, you can talk to them, social workers, counselors, psychologists, and so forth. Some schools have resources, some don't. Cognitive behavioral therapy is it's my foundation in my counseling background of working with, how do I help people develop more stress tolerance and distress tolerance without resorting to self-harm or hurtful behaviors or acting out in negative ways. And then what are the triggers when someone starts having anxiety flooding? It's learning how you work, how you function, getting some mindfulness, getting some awareness of how emotions function. And this is a great thing. This is, to me, this will generalize beyond, if you're stressed out because of your AP history class, but learning, how does that show up for you? What do you do when you're stressed? Do you bite your nails? I knew a girl had trichotillomania. She would actually pull her hair out as a way of managing. She would twist and pull. And some people, there are all kinds of ways of managing anxiety. Some people go and take an edible. There are 1,000 ways of managing. Some people go for a run. Some folks talk to a friend or take a bath or play some music. There are 1,000 ways. The whole thing is, how are you managing your distress? And it's really, really, really big. Learning how to manage distress. You're going to have distress in 10th grade. You're going to have some stress in high school. You might not get the co-op or internship you wanted when you're a junior in college, or you go out for jobs, you don't get them. And when you're a senior, there's going to be stress somewhere. And the whole thing is, what do you do when you're stressed? So again, the academics is practice for life. And I would talk through, what are the triggers? When this happens, I got a grade back and I freaked out, or they announced the exam and I'm really worried, and and so forth. So one thing also, Marsha Linehan, she's one of the key founders of DBT, very important therapy for, for depression, bipolar, for anxiety in general, for borderline personality stuff. But giving validation. So don't dismiss. And that's something where it's like my student yesterday told me she went and talked to her parents about her fears of what's happening politically. And her parents are like, just ignore it. It's not, you can't change it. And that's not validation. That's not empathy. And I think empathy is really good when you want to bring someone and calm someone down. I understand. And that's where part of I show you my wounds. That's an empathic connection. I'm trying to connect with you on this level versus, you shouldn't worry about that, or you're overblowing this, or it's not. Don't. If you're dismissive, it's not going to help them regulate. And then we want to give our kids skills of how do I regulate this. And so an empathic connection is one way to do that as a beginning. And sometimes they're blowing things out of proportion, but search for what is valid. It's not my life is over. I'm not going to get in this, but like, oh, wow, I hear, you're stressed. Acknowledge, you can kind of touch, oh, you sound like you're really stressed about this, or it's really giving you a lot of concern, keeping you up. And so validate what's valid and don't shut them down, even if they're way off the mark. Don't, or else they just may tune out. And then suddenly there's a filter up and they can't hear you anymore if you don't validate at some level. And sometimes students can be channeling the anxiety of other people. And again, a good bit of this is genetic in terms of high arousal, high anxiety versus low arousal. Not always, but it's your kids' genes, half of them came from your mom, half of them came from your dad. So even if you got, you have your dominant recessive genes of meiosis, it could be they're getting your mom's anxiety, whereas you're cool as a cucumber too. And so be mindful of that. Be aware that things do go through in our genes. Look for a family connection. And part of it is one of my students had a lot of anxiety about her performance academically, and she was getting some of that anxiety because the parent, a single mom, didn't have the financial resources and was very clear that we need a scholarship. There's no way I could pay for you and your brother to go to school without a scholarship. And the kid felt that. And the kid understood that my performance is going to affect my family's finances. And that burden, that weight, even though it's a true fact, this child was internalizing that and getting really upset, even like running, crying out of tests, and learning she wasn't able to ground her own arousal around her performance academically. So it's part of it is making sure that your kid is not taking on your own concerns or anxieties or fears. And then doing your own work if you do have that and you express that. Learning how to self-nurture for yourself and then for your kid. And being transparent about how do you quiet your mind? Do you play certain music? It's really, really funny. My daughter, she's going to be 5 in April, but now at night she wants to hear Enya for like 10 minutes on. I have a little Alexa thing, and because I forever and ever and ever I played Enya since I was probably like 18 to 20, and when I write, when I do work, college, master's, PhD, I play Enya all the time in the background, and now my daughter wants to hear it before she falls asleep, and to me it's very cute, but it's one of those things where it's calming. And when I'm working, I can really focus with certain music that to me is kind of grounding and calming. Normalizing anxiety for your kid. Your kid has anxiety about academics, about their math, about their language. Normalize it. Talk about it. It's just part of being a human, having some concerns, some stress, arousal. You're going to experience all of it. Doesn't mean you're broken or flawed. Having some anxiety is very normal. And then you share your story where it's happened in your life. And for you, it's modeling coping. Here's what I do. I take a walk. I'm a big fan of using nature. Nature is very grounding. I do some exercise, which is a very nice way to ground your anxiety and your feelings, your emotions. Take some breaths, whatever it is, and share what works for you. I like this book. I read it now. It's probably been 15 years, but been doing this for a while. But Dan Siegel, very, very smart fella, writes about anxiety and in Mindsight, he talks about the structure of how anxiety works at a chemical level and a structural level. And I've talked to my students about this before, talking about the different brain regions with the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And for even for kids, I talk about the amygdala and how you're scanning, you're searching for threats. And if you see it, you glob onto it, and that becomes more important than things which aren't threatening. And that's very adaptive long term for survival. And you look at Sapolsky's research, primates, and it's been there for millions of years, but it's not as helpful when that fear center becomes too dominant. Self-talk, anxiety is reinforced and supported by the things you tell yourself, your inner dialogue. which can be very healthy and can be very calming, or it can be very anxiety sustaining. And so your inner critic, you get a bad grade in a test, and then you can go off on yourself, critique yourself, and then you start to pile on versus soothing, calming. It's going to be okay. We'll pivot. We'll do better next time. And so your internal messaging is really, really powerful. And sometimes students are going to come and they may have had a bad grade on a test. And then they go into this awfulizing, overgeneralizing. I always do, I never do good here. And if that's your self-appraisal, you're going to have some fear. If I always tank these things, my tests always, if you catch your kid doing it always, I always try to, try to bring them back from that. Has there ever been a time, like in this class, in this moment with this teacher, my student who's struggling right now with this computer science class, is she's having to take it, it's a remote class and she's not, and then the teacher is really a stickler. And if you don't give it the answer she wants or the answer key exactly verbatim, she gets almost no credit. So in this instance, yeah, with Professor Mayo, it's really challenging. But in other areas, this is not you always in all contexts. I try to put it in context to make it so it's not overgeneral. I also try to help students tamp down the external comparisons. Females do this more, looking around, they know the hierarchy. Where am I? How did Jennifer do? How did Leanne do? How did Lenore do? How did I do? Guys do less of this, typically on average. But I want the comparison to be to oneself and what grade do I need, not where am I fitting in the hierarchy, which can be in of itself stressful. And again, I mentioned the dichotomous that there's a perfect outcome, this or either amazing or awful, versus there's a whole range of gray. And we as adults know that, but part of it is imparting to our kids. It's not black or white. That's really an immature kind of way of thinking, but even adults do this, grandparents do this. But Ellis talks about, Albert Ellis, one of the founders of cognitive therapy, and beware of catastrophizing, awfulizing, or, he called it masturbation. This has to be, I must do this or everything stinks. I have to get this internship or this grade or this outcome or this role in the play or this peer leadership post, or my life is worthless or not meaningful, whatever it is. And the whole thing is, can you imagine a potential where you don't get the A in the class? Let's say you get the 89 in Comp Pol. Is that, you get the 3 on the AP. Does life can go on? And my thing is talking in terms of preferences. And I hear you, and you absolutely would prefer to get an A in the class. You love a 91. But let's say, things don't work on the exam. You get an 83, and then you drop down a point. So, you know what? It's not the end. And the world goes on, and you can try again and come back next semester, other classes, try to balance it out. But I hear your strong preference for having an A, but it's not the end of the world. And it's going to be okay. And let's work and put all our effort towards the A. If we get it, amazing. But if you get the 89, it's okay. And I try to take away the sting or the pressure or the pylon of it's A or bust. And because that in and of itself causes stress. And but again, shoot for the A. And let's put in place what are the behaviors that you can control. Let's put in more time. Let's go to the review sessions. Let's use a tutor, whatever we're going to use. But no matter what the outcome is, it's going to be okay. And I believe that, and I know that to be true in my experience. And this, the inner coach, those people who have less anxiety typically have a pretty decent inner coach that's helping us deliver some messages, things that the problem-solving centers. That's going to be okay. Here's what we can do in our control, and not the, oh God, it's going to be crazy if you don't get this outcome, and so forth. So again, the frontal cortex, that is your friend, that's your buddy. Albert Bandura out of Stanford, a giant in the theory, in psychology, talked about self-determination, the theory of we learn from each other, and we learn from our own experiences, and like learning is social. And one of the things Bender talks about is giving students mastery experiences. And anxiety comes when you have low, he called self-efficacy, your sense of your own abilities. And you begin to build your self-belief when you have some successes. So when you want to lower anxiety, create or manifest, give your students some low-level, low-stakes successes, and then build from there. And maybe I fail up here, let me ratchet down, have some success, then I can build up. And that's something that as you begin to show, oh, wow, I did okay on this problem set. Oh, wow, I did better on this thing. Maybe I'm not so bad at this subject. And so it's giving yourself some small wins, and then the anxiety tends to decrease. One thing I've done with students before, which is also a move in therapy, is try to externalize the fearful voices and give the voices a name. Give the voices, I've had kids try to draw the picture of the anxiety monster or the worry beast, Murray the worry. And like, oh, there's the worry, there's Murray the worry again. Saying, oh gosh, like, and creating some cognitive distance from that line of thinking, that kind of not dude, I'm so nervous, but oh, that's this part of me delivering anxious messages, and you create some separation from the ego and the self, and that's really powerful and really helpful. And so, if kids can do that separation of giving, like externalizing it some, that's beneficial. Other things, I love a strengths-based focused of what are other areas of your life where you've managed stress. And sometimes kids are athletes, or they're in debate, or they do theater, or they do a cappella, or they do something where they have to perform, and there's some kind of stakes or audience. And I always ask, how do you manage stress in that domain before you go out on the pitch for wrestling or basketball or tennis or gymnastics? What do you do to calm yourself? Can we bring some of that in, to the domain of academics and before a test and so forth? The body is one of the keys to managing anxiety. There are things I've worked with my students. There's something that's very simple and free. It's called the emotional freedom technique. It's just tapping. It's using the meridians. And I've done this, and there's research on this, how it affects people with PTSD and anxiety. And it actually shows real benefit. So all this is, and this is very simple. You can Google this. You tap these points in sequence, about, I'm nervous about my French test coming up. You tap 7 times, top your head, tap your eyebrow, tap the side of the eye, under the eye, under the nose. And as I'm tapping, I find my body starting to relax a little bit. And then, like, every time I do this, I don't understand it necessarily, but with the meridians, but there's something to this. And some students, I've seen Olympic athletes do this before their meets. And tapping is very simple. You tap very, very simply. Breathing. We know that there's a interaction between breathing, the breath, and anxiety. When you're slowly, now we know physiologically it has to do with the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve goes, down all the way to the sacrum, all the way up to the brainstem, and it carries messages to and from. And when you're doing deep diaphragmatic breathing, you are stimulating in a slow pattern the vagus nerve, and that sends a parasympathetic calming activity, so it slows down. So when respiration starts slowing, it affects blood pressure, starts calming down, and other things in terms of skin tension. It starts to calm down the body. And so deep breathing does work. And you can show kids and demonstrate this, or go to any kind of class or watch a video about not breathing where the shoulders go up, like really, the diaphragm goes out, like from the belly. Deep breathing, mindfulness, you're observing, you're watching, you're not reacting. It's like, oh, there I am. I'm getting nervous. I'm getting fearful. Like, take a minute, take a beat, watching. Oh, now I'm imagining this. Okay, so you're like, going to you're the observer sense of consciousness. You're observing yourself. And that's part of metacognition. That's part of, oh, I'm doing that pattern again. I'm getting nervous again. And that's part of self-regulation, which is really lovely, versus you start getting out of control and you can't regulate. I have a 4-year-old and I have a 2-year-old, and they depend upon me to help them regulate their arousal levels. And my daughter gets upset about something so silly. She spills water or drops thing, and then she's in her bed crying and yelling. And I go and I calm her down. I physical touch. It's okay. And like, my breathing pattern, my calming voice helps her calm down. And I know at some point in the future, I'm not going to be there. And I'm hoping she's going to be able to internalize this, and I'm helping her regulate. And the touch and that slow pattern is actually of the afferent nerve is actually very calming. I have a slide on that in a couple of things. So there's meditation, mindfulness. Kids can learn this. Kids can practice this. Some kids do. There are many apps for this. I use one called Waking Up, Sam Harris' app. There are other apps. Anything that's contemplative. I do Qigong. I went to my class this morning. I do yoga. I'll go there on Friday. Things of learning how to calm yourself down, how to regulate arousal is going to help you with academics and everything in life. There are kids, sometimes my daughter, there's yoga in her preschool, which she didn't love it, but there are things, there's Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, anything where you're moving, using your body. Exercise is amazing for managing anxiety. Kids who get worked up on anxiety before school, taking a jog, getting on the bike. It releases endorphins, endogenous morphine, and dopamine, serotonin. Really good stuff. And it also suppresses cortisol, stress hormone. So exercise is amazing at regulating anxiety and helps with 1,000 other things, with depression, anxiety. It's one of the best things to move our body. We're designed to move our bodies. And so that helps you calm yourself down in many cases. Sleep. When you are not getting enough sleep, you typically are going to have more of a hair trigger for your emotions, and you're going to have more of a challenge to regulate arousal. Sleep is your best friend for emotional regulation. Teenagers, they need 8, 9 hours. Some of them are getting 6 or 7, and then they crash hard during the weekend. But that often during the week, you may have a little more anxiety, more fear, because you're not getting enough rest. You're not cleansing the brain. Waste products are removed. Emotions also get reset and replayed. Something happens during REM sleep where you get into this activation pattern where it goes like rapid cycling and things move from the hippocampus over to the cortex, and memories are shifted, they're changed. Like in the morning, you're kind of calmed down. You go to bed really upset, get a good night's sleep, and then the arousal level is lower, and you're actually working on processing things at night as you're sleeping during REM. So other things, nature is extremely calming. Even hearing sounds of nature, hearing a waterfall, hearing a water fountain, taking a walk outside, looking at nature helps you calm yourself down. That kind of visual pattern, after millions of years, in a quiet, calm place, with less stimulation, and we get into a different rhythm, different place. So nature is amazingly. I love gardening. I love pulling weeds. This morning I was in my front. I was pulling weeds that are coming up now in my zoysia, and there's something calming and nice about it. On Monday I was cutting bamboo, which causes me anxiety because my neighbor 10 years ago put bamboo in, and now it's spreading over like 7 yards. If I have bamboo, my neighbors have bamboo. And so, but again, I get out there as hacking with the machete and my loppers, and there's something I find relaxing about being out in nature. And so that might be your kid too. So human touch, I mentioned with my daughter Juliet's all upset, or my son Theo, they fall, they get hurt. Human connection, human touch, because we know it releases oxytocin, especially the calming touch. And that actually lowers activation of the amygdala and lowers levels of cortisol. So human touch, and that's there's a theory that we're touching each other less. We have less human contact. We're on the screen. We're mediating our contact by the screens, and there's less human, kids aren't playing games together and smacking each other. They're playing games on their headsets, looking at their screen, and their friends are far away. And without that normal human contact, we could be getting a little more anxious. And so human touch matters. Your food matters. You could be on the cycle of the sugar rising and falling at the crash of high sugar, then crash, hyperglycemic, hypoglycemic versus slow carbohydrates, proteins, fats, making sure your kids are dosing. And if they're using caffeine, that can also, it shoots up, then it wears down. Then you become dependent upon caffeine. So being mindful of what they're putting into their bodies, right? Getting the nutrients you need and like slower carbs, not the high glycemic carbs, and fats and proteins. This is a thing that one of my colleagues taught me. It's called havening. Google it. It's free. And again, all it is like when Juliet gets upset, I find she feels better when I, calmly, touch in a slow pattern. And that's something which we learned when we were infants. And mothers do that. Rat pups lick their pups in a very calming, like repetitive way. That repetitive thing, those afferent nerves go back and feed, and that kind of rhythm somehow is calming to the brain. The brain has a certain activation pattern, a certain rhythm, and that slow, calming touch seems to relax the brain and the body. So havening is just repetitive. It's like you're doing this to your own face. You can go if your kid's having a test, they can go in the bathroom stall, close the door, and do some, just very calming back and forth with your hands. Just do it for 10 seconds and see how it feels. And the one I like, my favorite one is the arms. Where when I do this, like do it like 15 times, slow, repetitive, and I'm imagine yourself calming myself down, taking some deep breaths. And the combination of deep breaths plus this repetitive activation of the afferent nerves can help regulate the nervous system and activate the parasympathetic nervous system when you're up in the sympathetic when you're aroused. So again, touch, repetitive touch. Heart math, there's a whole heart math solution. I have some things. where they like putting your hand on your heart and shifting from, appreciation of someone you love, some positive memory. And imagine you're breathing in through your heart. And when you shift to appreciation, it tends to t tamp down stress and arousal. Someone you love, someone you care about, your favorite pet, your best friend, imagining a time laughing with them, or it's like even holding them in your mind, someone you love, or a memory of being loved, or with a family member, your grandmother you adore. Just taking a second, evoking that memory, and that can calm down arousal as well. Physical objects. I've used these. I still have crystals and whatnot. I used to give talks to big high schools in and around the country, and I would be a little bit nervous when I'd be out there in my mid-20s going in front of a big group of people, and I would have crystals in my pocket. And if I needed something to hold on to, I would grab the crystal. And that would, to me, would be very helpful, having something I can hold on to or a little, medallion. People use rosary beads for that, to help regulate arousal. And other thing is imagining someone who's more centered, more grounded. People use figures, people use religion. Talk about, if you're Christian, could be some, it could be Jesus, could be some figure who is centering, I'm partial to, there's a school of thought about like I like Carl Jung talks about the archetypes. You might have some inner elder, inner wise figure, an inner king you could speak to, call to evoke, or like a more, there's someone, what would so-and-so do? And try to bring that energy in, that calming, centering energy of someone who's, more advanced psychologically than you are, and so forth. Bring it in. Journaling. Very simple. When you get in repetitive, recursive thoughts about how you might screw up, things might go wrong in the class, take a minute, take 10 minutes, stop and sit down and write. Not for, don't put it out there for consumption externally, not social media, but actually something just for you. And I'm nervous, and it shows up like this. I'm thinking about this. And that helps crystallize these thoughts, which are just recursive and repetitive. And it's really nice to help stop that rumination, because it kind of grounds you, and you're seeing your words on the page is helpful, just getting out of your head. And there's this research, Sean Baylock wrote this study with Ramirez in Chicago. People who wrote about their anxiety academically had better performance academically. And so that's, very, very simple intervention, helping reduce the flow of, the outside world. Too much news, again, put a limit. Don't ignore it, but 30 minutes, not 3 hours. Taking breaks from the net, freeing up spaces. Balancing your priorities is also important. Social life. You can't be too focused on your academics. You need to be balanced, or you're going to be nervous if you aren't seeing your friends enough. Our friends keep us sane, and they will now and later when they're in college. So you have to see your friends. You have to play, or it gets stressful. Balancing, finding a dynamic. Um, don't focus too much on performance, and that can really take away the joy of adolescence and childhood, and create all kind of other problems. If I can't control my grades, I might control how much I weigh or my food. And there are a lot of folks with food disorders, and some of that comes from anxiety. I can't control this. Well, let me control this. And I know personally people have been very much into that cycle of anorexia and bulimia, and a lot of it was stress, academic stress, and stress socially as well. Um, Make sure you're not overscheduled. Make sure you have enough room on the plate. Make sure you're getting enough sleep. Make sure you don't overdo, the phones and things. They're charged in the charging dock at night, not in their bedrooms, and so forth. And sometimes when there's anxiety, there's just too much on the kid's plate. What can I have to reduce something. There's too many activities, too hard classes. I've got to back off somewhere. And just by taking things off the plate, the level of anxiety and arousal and stress decreases. And that's important too, looking at their schedule. So helping them find the right balance, our friends, make sure we're seeing encouraging social interaction, engagement. And those relationships are the joy of life. Making sure the kids are also doing things they like to do and that gives them pleasure. I like to paint. I did some painting yesterday, and some people one of my students likes to bake. One of my students likes to make candles. I'm like, whatever works, whatever is that nice, calm, repetitive, like find it, work it, find some joy in there so it's not all stressful. And don't just numb out and watch Netflix or surf the net. Like do something physical, use your body. Don't just look at the screen. Screens, we have too much of the screens. And also broaden how we define success. Kids can get too hung up on, again, the GPA, this outcome, this college, and make sure they're balancing other things. And there's a broader, if I don't get the school or this tier of schools, there are many, many, many pathways towards having a really rich, amazing life. And you could give examples of your friends who are doing a phenomenal life who didn't go to that Ivy League school. Half of my friends who are crushing it in life went to Georgia, and they're just killing it academically. I'm sorry, now it's socially, professionally, financially. And so people have this really narrow, it's this grades, this outcome, this school, this grad school. I'm like, dude, look at all these folks who went to other schools, state schools, and they are just crushing life. So that's, it's helpful having those other counterexamples. So shifting things toward relationships, authentic engagement, intimacy, vulnerability, and putting less focus on performance and performing a self. Really good. And again, technology, be mindful. There can be too much of a good thing. Some connections, great, but it can go too far. You know this. Make sure it's not cutting into exercise, sleep, schoolwork, and relationships. And strong friendships, they are what keep us healthy and sane. And strong network of peers lowers loneliness, lowers depression, lowers anxiety. So if your kids are anxious, nervous, make sure they're going and seeing their friends in person, hanging out, not just talking on the phone, or rather texting or chatting or Instagramming or Snapchatting or TikToking each other. Make sure they're seeing each other, getting the human mammal interaction. So at Applerouth, we talk about the science of learning and art of human connection. That's part of our work. We do three things: academic tutoring, we help kids with test prep, and we do executive functioning coaching. There's something coming up. We're doing a few things with the academic world. If your kids are stressed about APs, we're having some AP, some workshops coming up in the next month or so. So this may help kids who are nervous about performance. We actually have some good people helping on these, AP Chem or in US, AP, BC Calc. So these are available to y'all. And here's a quick little poll just to help us if you can use any support from us. Do you want any support from Applerouth in any other way? And if so, let us know. All right. So now I did save a little time, 8 minutes. It's a pretty big deck, but it's a lot I wanted to cover. And I like all this, helping kids with their self-regulation. To me, it's really teaching them a major life skill. So go ahead and let's open up some questions. I'm going to open up my Q&A, and I'd like you to respond. Are there any questions or things that you want to know about your kid or something you've heard? If I can provide some insights or feedback, I'd love to answer any questions you have. And if there are no questions, that's okay too. I know that was a lot to process, and it might be beneficial to watch it again. Sometimes I tend to give a lot of information, but that's how I tend to like to over deliver than give you less to chew on. Well, there might not be any questions, y'all, which is totally okay. So if you do have questions which do come up, oh, there's one. How do I deal with someone who has a mental fog covering their person? Someone who's experiencing a mental fog. Now, that's interesting. Um, I would want to process to see if there's something underlying that in terms of looking at their behaviors, looking at, are they getting adequate sleep, adequate nutrition? Why the source of the mental fog. I want to help them process in terms of what's going on. Are there moments when they're not foggy? Is it constant fog? Are there things where they get excited, tuned in? There's more, serotonin, more, norepinephrine, or is it constantly they're just checked out? And if it's a constant thing, I see if I can get through them. Sometimes I need some more support, some more help. I talk to someone if they're really checked out and mentally foggy. But I would look for, is it selective attention, selective engagement, or is it really just there's a pervasive, they're never engaged. They're just constantly in there's a foggy miasma over their personality. And it's like, what's going on? Can I shake things up? Can I get them out of a new context? Can I go for a walk outside? Can I get them to put their technology away if it's a phone thing? What is it? How do I get you moving, excited, talking? So I would say go for a walk. If there's anything I can do is get their body moving, their blood flowing, you know, perfuse, the tissues and see if that change of context and venue can help create a different conversation than if they're just in this kind of evasive, foggy space. Or maybe, exercise, movement, those things can help get the brain active. Um, but yeah, otherwise, see if you can help them process and see if just kind of check in with them, what's going on. If they're able to open up with you, they can open up to you, there may be someone else they can open up to. But I don't want someone to live in a fog because they're going to really miss out on a lot. Any other questions? Any other, well, okay, here we go. Thank you. Amazing information for my own kids as well as my eighth grade science students. How can I get more information about their worries without invading their privacy, especially if it's interfering with their academics? Now, there's a way to engage if a student seems to be anxious or seems to be worried or seems to be they're different. Again, as a parent, you're looking for changes in sleep, changes in attendance, changes in eating habits if they seem like they're more nervous. Part of it, for your own kids, if it's your own kids, you're going to have opportunities to check in and what's going on. And part of it for, kind of, I show you my stuff. I'm really been concerned about this, or I'm concerned about the politics. I'm concerned about my sister who works at the DOJ, or I'm talking about, and maybe opening up, like, what are things that are on your mind? What are you thinking about? What keeps you up or what gets you, concerned or upset. But I go, you go is a pretty natural way of self-disclosure as a way of evoking some interaction. The other thing is just, asking, checking in with them, what's going on in a very simple, easy way, or I've noticed something, I just want to check in to see if they're going to be willing to share with you. But if they don't share, you might share first and see if they'll take the bait and they'll go into the space of a little vulnerability with you. But yeah, so if it's affecting their academics, I'd want to find a way to check in. And it's like, just I want to be supportive and I want to be helpful. And I'm curious and I really want to show up for you. And the way you phrase it versus like you're poking or needling or not respecting. But give it so they can answer if they want to, they don't have to. And sometimes they'll reflect back if you lead with the outcome you're looking for. They might follow you into that space, leading with vulnerability on your part. Okay, sure, anytime. Anything else? Any other questions, concerns I can help with? And you can always reach out to us later, info@Applerouth, if things come up, if things you want to mention or talk about. A lot of our tutors do work with students when it comes to academic and like test anxiety. We do a lot of, testing work with kids with APs and SATs. And so some kids do have real stress, and that's part of our work. It's helping kids address that if they really have concerns, and it's interfering with their performance. That's something that we do train our tutors in, helping them with anxiety. But there's obviously a level we refer out if it comes to clinical generalized anxiety disorder. It's really affecting their quality of life. We want to go to someone with a, higher level of training. But we definitely talk about some of the foundational ways of managing anxiety, if you're nervous about performance in a certain test, things like that. All right, y'all. Well, it's almost that time, 8:58. So thank you for being part of the webinar. There'll be other ones in the future. If you need help in any area with your student and we can be a resource, please reach out. And everybody, have a great night.